everybody. Welcome back to Reconstructing Health. Our what is this? This is like our seventh episode now, I think. But I hope you enjoyed last week's two-parter. We got really good feedback on it, and people really liked the content, so I'm really happy about that. And we also gained a listener from the Netherlands, so that was really fun. And hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode because this week's episode is going to be on environmental racism. And our special guest this week is Emmett Norris. We are so delighted to have him on this podcast, and we're just going to head straight into the interview. So hope you enjoy it, and then we'll see y'all after.
Hello, this is the beginning of the interview with our guest speaker of the episode, Emmett Norris. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And to preface, we'll be discussing a variety of subtopics within the overarching focus on environmental racism. So to start off, can you please introduce yourself and your research or interests in your field of study?
Definitely. So thanks for having me here. So I am a PhD candidate at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, part of UCSD, where I work between geochemical fields and epidemiology. So in geochemistry, I primarily study the composition of particulate matter or dust. So I look at its chemical nature, where it comes from, how it's emitted, the atmosphere, how it's transported, maybe humans are exposed to it, and then where it's deposited. And the epidemiology side of things, we're really interested in how humans are differentially susceptible or exposed to particulate matter and the kind of health outcomes that emerge from that. So we're interested in which communities are differentially susceptible to health outcomes and what different types of particulate matter might be driving those outcomes, which kind of comes down to this double jeopardy idea of certain communities are exposed to more particulate matter and because of comorbidities, more susceptible to negative health outcomes. So that's what I do. And I'm coming from a background in earth science, and I'm really motivated by how earth scientists and earth science can be used to support community health and understanding our changing world.
Wow, that's very interesting and very perfect for this episode. Um, so for some background knowledge, what are some common pollutants and their risk factors?
Common pollutants, yeah. So lots of different things come to mind. As in the realm of air pollution, particulate matter is one, and that could be from many different sources, along with ground level ozone and different gaseous aerosols that can come from industries. Some of the big ones that people are really worried about as far as human health would be these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are uniquely damaging to human health. And in my world, I'm really interested in particulate matter specifically and the ways that different sized particles go into your lungs at a different depth and the secondary reactions and inflammation and oxidative stress that a particle can cause in your body, in addition to its chemical nature. So certain things like lead are neurotoxins. So in addition to having oxidative stress inflammation happen when you're exposed to a particle, there can also be secondary, tertiary interactions due to the actual toxicity of an element in your body. But in the environment, depending on where someone lives, depending on their occupation, the community they're in, some of the most damaging pollutants can be exposure to traffic. Traffic is known to be one of the most harmful types of air pollution. And in general, air pollution causes 7 million deaths per year. So it's one of the most significant dangers that humans face in the world. But other types of pollutants as well can be in water. Specifically, people are interested in kind of the enrichment of certain pesticides or certain things like caffeine in the water stream that can cause harm, in addition to elements like lead or arsenic, uranium in water that can cause a significant amount of harms and long-term impacts from exposure. So there's a wide range of pollutants in the atmosphere, and a lot of them are invisible. So it makes it challenging for someone, an individual, to be in control of exposure.
Mm-hmm. So, what are some of the long-term health impacts of these pollutants?
Yeah, so actually, I've been reading a lot of papers recently. A lot of folks, predominantly talk about cancer or acute impacts from like heart attacks or long term respiratory or cardiovascular impacts from a certain exposure. But cancer is definitely widely spoken about as the long term body burden from working in a certain industry or living in a certain community. Ongoing exposure to low levels of air pollution can cause harm. But more recently, folks are realizing things like Alzheimer's or ADHD can come from exposure to air pollution, and even in uterus. So a lot of research now is looking at autism or certain cognitive impacts of exposure of a child while their mother is pregnant. In addition to like neurological defects and heart defects for children. So there's quite a wide range, everything from forgetfulness to Alzheimer's to cancer, and certain types of impacts are more common, which are related to like impacts on your respiratory system that might be more on an acute level. But I think the thing to realize is putting a foreign particle into your body over time can lead to just a degradation in your immune system. So air pollution is oftentimes thought of as a comorbidity. So it can exacerbate diabetes, it can exacerbate other issues. And it might not cause them to begin with, but it could, for example, a lot of research in the United States looked to COVID deaths, and communities that were facing worse air pollution in general had a higher mortality rate. Not related to necessarily more cases, but just a greater worse health outcomes from COVID. So there's a lot of things going on that air pollution can kind of exacerbate.
Wow. Okay. So, how do racial disparities connect to pollution exposure in the U.S.?
Very tightly. I think kind of in the overarching concept of environmental justice or environmental racism, I think it's good to look at some of the systemic factors that are going on that cause exposures to begin with. I think the field of environmental justice looks at how certain communities, because of race or economic status, are exposed to more particulate matter and also are located near kind of hazardous industries or land uses. So that's kind of begin with that there is a kind of differential layout of hazards in our country, and because of a number of factors, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately um, living near these. So, but I guess to begin with, the idea of racial capitalism is really good to bring up. I think recognizing that the kind of the foundation of our country is built on the exploitation of mostly Black communities and also immigrant communities. So the very functioning of our country works through exploiting certain people, and that you can think of that starting with slavery, but also through the exploitation of migrant farm workers. So there's an ongoing process of using certain people for specific aims, and a lot of that is kind of occurs alongside exposure to or living in an unsafe environment. So you can think about that in a number of ways. But one thing to bring up in this general concept is in our free market system, many corporations or kinds of processes target communities of marginalized communities or most importantly, Black and Brown communities for the location of industries, knowing that politically, economically, some communities have less agency, and thus there's likely more profit or success for a certain industry to be a polluting industry, causing unsafe environmental conditions in an existing Black or Brown community. So I think it's really important to realize that while we might think that there's dangers and we're all equally susceptible to them, it's just really not the case. There's been a lot of research going on, for example, that 78% of children who go to school within 150 meters of a large road are non-white. So that there's a differential from the very, very beginning that certain children are exposed to more air pollution. And further other ways, I'm forgetting the statistics right now, but I believe it is that white people in the United States are exposed to 17% less air pollution than they emit. So They emit things through traffic or through driving or consumption. But certain communities, people in our country, are exposed to less of the pollution than they emit themselves. And other people, I think Black Americans are exposed to, I believe it's 56% more pollution than they emit. So certain people in our country aren't actually creating the source of pollution, but are exposed to it. So
Mhm.
looking along racial lines as far as exposure is really important to understand the underlying mechanisms that are reinforcing some of these exposures. And that goes back to the 1930s and redlining, where certain people were not given the access to be able to get a home loan, to be able to have financial security or mobility, allowing for greater protections from certain environmental harms. So there's a very deep-rooted history in our country of having differential exposure and treatment of people and their safety because of race.
Mhm. Um, so do you know of any recent or past initiatives directed towards combating environmental racism? Like how, if there are any like policies that address the issue of pollution disparities and how effective they have been?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to bring up. And I'll say for one, I think is a really telling process is the Environmental Protection Agency, or called the EPA, has an Office of Civil Rights, and so their entire focus inside the government agency of the EPA, trying to create environmental health and look at chemical emissions and things like this. Within that branch, there's an office specifically looking at protecting civil rights, with the thought of environmental injustices in the past being something they want to look at. And since its conception, it has submitted or investigated zero actual violations of injustices, even though communities have submitted uh, their unique exposures or specific industries that they believe have violated their civil rights, and along racialized lines committed environmental injustices. And so this is one example of an initiative that was designed to address this conversation, and theoretically, as it's part of the government, has given every opportunity to be able to do something about this, or really understand the mechanisms or specific situations, such as the location of an industry disproportionately impacting a certain community. It has had the chance to do so, but has not actually gone through the process of investigating or finding any situations unsafe. So I think kind of telling in the larger picture that everything is known, I guess, as far as like there are stats, there are studies that really point to the fact that different people in our country are uniquely exposed to and face the burdens of unsafe environments. But effectively, there has been very little actual investment at a government level to take any steps to change this. But the initiatives that are successful are largely community led. Like the Mothers of East Los Angeles is an organization that's been around for a very long time, really directly addressing specific polluting sources in Los Angeles to protect their community. And they have had success, but the government, given all the money in the world, has not. So I think that's the kind of conversation that you see a lot pop up. Is even with finances, even with all of the structures, there has been very little actual investment in understanding this issue.
I was about to ask about community involvement and impacts as well. So that was
Yeah,
a good
yeah.
transition.
Well, I could speak on some other topics also, or kind of other cases if that would be interesting.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So one topic that have spent part of my PhD interested in and learning about and studying is concerns of air pollution and water pollution in the Imperial Valley, in the Salton Sea region, just to the east of San Diego County. So, which is a really interesting and very terrible case of environmental injustice, environmental racism. If I can go into the story a little bit, if that's interesting. Okay. Kind of dating back to when Spanish colonists first started stealing land in this area in Southern California from the Native Americans who were living here and whose land this is. Um, began pushing people off of the coasts. First Native American people, and then afterwards Black and immigrant communities who came with the Spanish. And this has led to one portion, which is kind of funneling people into certain environments that were unsafe to begin with, and very separately. There is a multi-hundred-year process of manipulating this environment, redirecting the flow of the Colorado River into this basin, which is now called the Salton Sea, for agricultural purposes. So this very intensive manipulation of this fragile, arid ecosystem that has been under fluctuations and that the native communities have been working with for tens of thousands of years. This very specific manipulation has caused a situation that now is occurring, which is that this artificial inland sea, which has been accumulating pesticides and pollutants from agriculture over the last 100 years, is now eroding and is now decreasing in its lake levels from overuse and from climate, leading to a lot of this heavy metals and really just terrible sediment that is now being exposed as the lake level is going down to be in the atmosphere. So first of all, you have this manipulation of the environment through really intensive colonial use, and separately, certain people have been historically and currently moved to this area along racialized lines and for kind of ongoing capitalist projects, which has led to the situation where now a large migrant, mostly Hispanic, Chicanic community and indigenous folks are being exposed to really terrible pollutants and just bad air quality in general. And secondly, there's been really very little done to prevent this to begin with, and now there's been historically very little investment in actually addressing this issue along the similar lines that some people in our country are deemed as more disposable, and that their health is less valuable than others. So there has been very little statewide or countywide or federal investment in protecting these people from health. So there, for example, the asthma rates are 20% or more of children have asthma in this in the county, which is more than twice as high as the state average. In addition to many other specific issues that kind of are ongoing. So this is an ongoing environmental injustice that is very close to home for San Diego because we get a lot of our leafy greens and our cantaloupes, and a lot of our produce comes from this community. So we are invested in invested in this community economically because we want to benefit from it, but we are in doing so kind of condoning and supporting this ongoing harm to certain communities along racialized lines.
Can you talk about the disproportionate vulnerability marginalized communities have to natural disasters?
Yeah, I think natural disasters is also kind of baked into this. As I shared a little bit earlier, I think there's some important conversation to look at related to kind of mobility of certain communities, financial security, infrastructure to begin with, but also kind of political or federal investment in safety. So all of those things kind of come together during climate disasters or natural disaster. I think one of the best examples would be a lot of the flooding going on in the last years primarily in the South, in the United States, but also wildfires and COVID, and many other situations where you can see that first off, because of economic policies such as redlining, certain communities have less financial stability or mobility or protections because of kind of ongoing racialized institutions in our countries. So in that way, you could think of less ability to respond or be resilient from a climate disaster. And beyond that, infrastructural-wise, having safe places to go during a storm, or having city infrastructure or kind of regional infrastructure being able to adapt or deal with, for example, flooding or levees breaking, as the situation in Hurricane Katrina. So you could think of a long-term lack of investment from the government to protect people from natural disasters is another process. Another thing that's important to look at is comorbidities. So certain communities might be disproportionately dealing with other health issues um, uh, that might be exacerbated by a natural disaster. So dealing with uh, things such as diabetes or or bad air pollution might make a natural disaster all the more harmful. Um, and then finally, the support in the aftermath of a natural disaster, which communities are getting very fast aid and support and ongoing efforts at a federal or state level to really help families rebuild. Um, and you can look at this in the time it takes for the police or for someone to respond to different communities. So are there local first responders? The presence or timing of local first responders is also very much along racialized lines, and you can think of. So, anyways, this kind of overview. Some of those systemic factors really make it apparent how the initial harm and the response, and also the overall situation some people face due to natural disasters is very highly differential.
So what do you think can be done to better prepare emergency resources for these communities in terms of providing the necessary healthcare and medical services?
Very good question. I don't think I have a full answer to that as far as like a strategy goes myself. I think it would be very much good to look at some of the systemic factors. So I think there's this is more just from my personal philosophy, I guess, but if you don't mind me sharing that, I think there's an emphasis and there's kind of a history of wanting to use kind of charity or first response to support the community, but it's far more effective if the community has resources to support themselves. So I think a lot of that looks like really addressing where state and city, not federal funding is going to certain communities, and making sure those communities have the resources in the beforehand to help themselves, which is kind of the conversation. And of course, there are a lot of agencies, again, from the firefighters, especially in the US, in the West, to make sure that there's all the available institutions are functioning to respond, and those are definitely not equally apparent, and that's true also for education. Some communities have a higher investment from public education that might lead to greater awareness or response or understanding of the harms of natural disasters. So I really do feel like the answer is in generally making sure every community has equal access to safety to begin with, and then do everybody have equal access to the protections for a lot of communities in wealthy white locations. They have all of the first responders and the AEDs and everything set up in advance, and so it's less about trying to find specific packages to give to people in marginalized communities, but just making sure there's true equality in access to healthcare. And just briefly on healthcare, the location of hospitals and the distance for communities to get to hospitals and effective medical care is a huge issue. You can really look at effective, proximate, and affordable healthcare is very uneven in our country, and again, really is seen along racial lines.
You also mentioned comorbidities being a detriment for these communities in natural disasters. So, in addition to the physical illnesses people may already be suffering from, what impact do you think these natural disasters have on mental health?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would definitely I would refer to some of other uh, uh, thinkers and activists to respond to that more. And I'd love to share some resources or links, because I don't think I have all the best responses to these conversations. But um, what I've read in some authors, specifically from some one of folks in the Black radical tradition like Cedric Robinson, or Indigenous scholars, that I think has really been really useful for my own learning, is recognizing that the way that our country values human life is very apparent for some communities, and recognizing that economically and politically some lives are deemed as less valuable, and thus less money is spent to protect those lives, um, has a huge mental health role and effect on communities. And I think that's really also is really shown internationally. What international conflicts or what landslides, what earthquakes get responded to, and where is that money going? I think it's really easy to see for folks if their life is valued economically and also politically, and communally. So mental health, I can't speak from my own personal experience, or I don't want to speak for other folks about specific mental health related issues or responses. Every community will have a different response or social network or conversation or story that will support mental health conversations. But I have heard in my own reading and learning the kind of understanding and multi-hundred-year experience of certain communities not being a priority from our nation state, I think has a huge toll on mental health, and as well as lack of financial, social, environmental security, lack of those basic kind of forms of capital that many people take for granted. The lack of a home, if your home is taken away, it has a huge effect on mental health. In addition to not knowing not having support or finances to rebuild life or social scene.
Mm-hmm. So, um, going off more of like the lack of resources these marginalized communities have, what are the main barriers to like clean water access that these communities um suffer from, or
Yeah.
main barriers?
Well, I think that again is hard to answer in one response, since there are so many forms of water toxins and pollutants. For example, a lot of conversation in the last several years has been about lead in water streams in certain cities in the Midwest, which are not been solved. People stop talking about them, but they have not been addressed. Or in prisons, a lot of times prisons have terrible water quality, and so but that would be related to metals, and so exposure to hazardous water from poorly treated water, and that could be from lead, which is part of the pipes, which are weathering and should need to be replaced, but there's no involvement by the government or effective response to replace those, which they have been another in white communities, predominantly white communities. So that's one conversation of access to clean water. Separately, for example, in agricultural communities, the buildup of pesticides, herbicides, which are carcinogens and lead to epigenetic changes and pretty serious mutations in children, but also acute issues. Those are largely unchecked. And so folks living near or around agricultural activity, again, predominantly, I think the 73% of farm work in the United States or farm workers are migrants in the United States. So you can think of the exposures of farm workers or farm workers to pollutants being overwhelmingly felt by migrant farm workers. So in those situations, super high levels of known carcinogens such as atrazine, which is not sold in the country it's produced. So this is a product that we use very heavily in the United States, but it's too dangerous to use in the country where it's produced, in Switzerland, or where it's sold. So I think that's very telling as far as like we are knowingly exposing certain people to pollutants and dangers. But since again they are for agriculture specifically, there's a lot of lack of oversight of regulation for safe environments, clean water, and particularly for migrant farm workers who don't have uh, political safety or a voice due to citizenship. Advocating for clean water is very hard. So one of the barriers to getting clean water in that situation would be lack of ability to advocate for themselves in a political or governmental level. And in other places, water quality, for example, in Cancer Alley in the south, would be related to just intensive industrial emissions and then exposures. A lot of communities, for example, in the Northeast, New England, have high levels of natural arsenic and uranium in the water stream. And that would be an issue of people living in rural environments getting wet water from wells that are untested. So there's a lot of barriers for specific communities, and a lot of that in general you could boil down to, again, investment in addressing, seeing, and protecting people from known hazards. So I think water quality is a really interesting conversation because it, similar to other forms of environmental injustice, environmental racism, is very highly specific. So it's easy for people to be like, oh, I don't know how to deal with this because, in general, there's a lack of investment and understanding of the situation.
So, with like the variety of barriers that people have to accessing clean water, what are some like short-term health effects of consuming contaminated water, or the long-term effects as well?
Yeah. So, for example, in the lead situation, lead's a neurotoxin, and it leads to specific different behaviors, and when it's in high concentration, which can lead to a number of very acute problems. Arsenic also has known to kill people in drinking it in high concentrations, so that's definitely a big hazard. Um, uh, for example, things like perfluorooctanoic acid, which has been in the news a couple of years ago as a byproduct or a component of making Teflon, as a surfactant making Teflon. And a lot of factories starting in the 1950s were using it very heavily, and rural communities in the Northeast and in the Midwest were exposed to large of that, leading to a lot of wide number of cancers and also mutations, birth defects in the children of folks who are exposed. So that is a big concern in water quality. You're saying the long-term impacts, though?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything again from I would say intergenerational or epigenetic mutations in DNA that would lead to humans passing on a legacy of exposure that would lead to difficulties developmentally or health from many scales. So I think that's one of the most significant forms of, if you call it biological warfare at some level, that really does impact certain communities and certain racial demographics, racial communities, communities based on race quite deeply. Um, and I think a lot of those studies, I would point you to Tyrone Hayes from UC Berkeley, who's done a lot of work looking at frogs and the multi-generational impact of exposure to herbicides on humans, and seeing it also in the environment, kind of demonstrating kind of this big project that is going on in our country that no one understands what's going to happen at the end of it. So yeah, again, I think long-term impacts really range the level. Again, exposure to a lot of aluminum can create Alzheimer's. Lead and arsenic, different forms of neurotoxins, can lead to all sorts of neurological and physical problems, and yeah, really anything you think of.
Do you think there are any like community level or individual level initiatives that can be taken to help increase access to clean water for these communities?
um, yeah, I will. I think that's also the hard question. I can't point to a specific initiative. I do think people don't make enough use of local government, kind of city council level government, or county or state level decisions that are being made to decide where budgets are going, and also forms of protection or um, regulation of known hazards. So I think working with communities to understand or to identify point sources or points of pollution, seeing what the harms are for that, and then really addressing the appropriate local government to mitigate those, I think would be the most effective thing. I feel like one of the ways that um, people misdirect some of the harm, but also uh, the burden for change is on communities to address the negative externalities or the symptoms of unsafe environments, such as trying to deal with the downstream impact of ecological and environmental health problems. The answer is to stop them from being polluted in the first place. So um, there is no safe level of pollution, and there should not be a system where the EPA sets a level of what's acceptable for people to expose to, and then everyone's just trying to live around that. I think greater conversation about and greater understanding of our power living in a democratic society. Not that it really functions for all humans or all Americans equally, but to find community level actions to protect each other. And I think also recognizing that, again, in our nation state, in a settler colonial world that is designed to exploit people, it's hard to expect too much from the government that is benefiting from people's exploitation and misuse. So um, I don't have a specific answer, but I think looking to, again, community organizations like the Mothers of East Los Angeles, who have multi-generational experience for a long period of time, actively protecting their communities at a grassroots level, knowing that the large organizations won't. And again, I would point you to a lot of activists, specifically a lot of the indigenous activists who have been working on this conversation for such a long time, since their communities started facing European colonialism. I think is where a lot of the power I see it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was all the questions I had from my end. If you have any closing remarks.
Yeah, well, really appreciate all of your questions, and I think this is a really interesting topic. Um, yeah, I think I would just end on kind of understanding that there is such a uh, rampant and systemic issue going on in our country where, for example, a black American is 4 times more likely to die from air pollution exposure than a white American. And some of those you know, injustices are kind of baked into the fabric of our country, and they kind of feel insurmountable or kind of circumstantial. But I think it's really important for folks to recognize how we actively continue and benefit. Some communities, some people benefit from how our country functions and prioritizes the health of certain people. Um, and there are institutions designed specifically to benefit off of certain bodies, um, and that all people should be indispensable to our health. And as David Pello, one of my an author I really highly prize, talks about, that we really need to change our basic conversation around basic exposures that are or have to occur, that all people are necessary in our future, and to find a resilient future, all people need to be seen as indispensable to that future. So really recognizing what kinds of injustices that we are currently okay with, and really coming back down to the bones of how do we want to live in a world that uh, gives all people a chance to have a healthy life, and that prioritizes a safe environment for all. And I think we'd address many of our other problems in our country and world, in climate problems as well, if we really change that fundamental switch, and started looking out for the health of all people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
really
you.
helpful and insightful.
Happy to share, and yeah, really appreciate your questions, and if it'd be useful, happy to share some of the learning or some of the sources of learning that I've had in my life.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Okay, hi. So I hope you all enjoyed listening to the interview. So to broadly open up the discussion, what are your initial or overall thoughts on what was discussed and what particularly stood out to you guys?
For me, as someone who studies racism in healthcare a lot, I mean, this had so many intersectionalities within it because environmental redlining and Cancer Alley and sacrifice zones has a lot to do with the health disparities in people of color and Black and Brown communities. And I have personally known Emmett's work and also his work with dust and the Salton Sea. And I loved how he brought up his own work with the Salton Sea because I don't think people realize how big of an impact that is on San Diego County, especially with the pollutants that are going to be like brought over by the wind to San Diego. So yeah, I just love the interview overall.
Yeah, the interview was very insightful. I felt educated after listening to it. It was also a little bit scary though. Like I didn't realize traffic was one of the most damaging pollutants out there and that air pollution of itself causes 7 million deaths per year. That is pretty scary.
Yeah, I think the way that Emmett just portrayed everything and kind of like really described how dangerous the situation is and how like we're impacted by it disproportionately was just so well done. And I think he really highlighted like just how much of a change we need for this issue. And especially coming from like a global health perspective and knowing how environmental justice is so important to health aspects, like I just really appreciated what he's doing with his work and the way he also said.
Yeah, I also found the interview super interesting. I had a clarifying question. Um, I think you guys mentioned the Cancer Alley in the South during the interview, and I didn't really know what that was. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to explain that.
Oh, I can explain that. Yeah. I did like my last in class was actually like one of my projects was Cancer Alley. So it's essentially the strip of land in the South, like in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and all these petroleum companies have built along the river there, and as well as like Black and Brown communities disproportionately live along this river. So they call it Cancer Alley, and 25% of America's petroleum um, production is at Cancer Alley. And now recent research is showing that the cancer rates at Cancer Alley are extremely high, including um, heart diseases and respiratory infections, et cetera, et cetera. So, and but the U.S. government knows about this, and they're not willing to do anything about it because of state officials in placing laws to allow these petroleum industries to continue polluting at these levels. The F like the the federal agencies really don't care about the pollution, for unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I didn't really know much about it either. But yeah, going off of what Jasmine said, I think Emma did a great job of like providing specific statistics that like gave a perspective on how badly marginalized communities are affected. Like when he mentioned how like 78% of children who go to schools near large roads are non-white, it really is an insane amount of people getting constantly exposed to toxic pollutants, which will like ultimately affect them later in life and like future generations. So prior to listening to the interview, how much background knowledge did you all have about pollutants and their health effects?
For me personally, since I study medical racism a lot, I did research on a paper for COVID, exactly what Emmett was talking about in the interview, about disproportionate effects of COVID on Black Americans because they have pre-existing conditions such as cardiovascular disorder, respiratory disorders, et cetera, that increase their risk of like getting COVID and also dying from COVID. And there was a paper that I read about like earlier this year about Georgia and about how these Black Americans in Georgia they had the least access to healthcare and hospital beds, and they also had the highest death rates in the county as well for COVID. So it just shows how air pollution and like environmental conditions causes these health conditions to be exacerbated to a whole nother level. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more so focused on how nutrition affects our bodies and how much we should be careful about what we consume in terms of diet because it really directly affects our physiological health. But after listening to this interview, I was like, wow, it's not just diet, it's not just nutrition that we should be careful about. It's also air pollution, like probably many other things. Like basically whatever we consume, anything that we consume can give out make us have neurological diseases or even cause death. And it's that was insightful for me.
I think for me, in terms of background knowledge, a lot of it comes from like my degree, which in a lot of our global health classes, sociology classes, we do have like topics about environmental justice, environmental racism, and then I've taken like environmental law in the past. But I'd say it's an adequate amount to have a discussion about, but it's not enough to like to know everything about the topic.
Yeah, for me, I feel like I didn't have that much background knowledge. I studied some environmental science in high school, I think. Yeah, so I knew like the basics about like particulate matter and like CFCs and that kind of thing. Um, but like I feel like I haven't studied anything about the systemic nature of this stuff. Um, is it okay if I go on a bit of a tangent? There's like this story. So like coming from LA, like pollution's really bad in LA, as everyone knows. Like the reason why the sunsets look crazy good is because of the smog and like all the air pollution. Um, so I remember my like ninth grade science teacher was telling us a story about like back in his day when he lived in like Venice in LA. They would have days where they would be like, okay, like don't go outside. If you're gonna go outside, wear a mask, or like don't come to school because the air pollution is just terrible today. And I think like that's kind of insane. Like, yeah.
Is that just in general or when the fire season was happening?
I think they had warnings for like the smog levels in the city. Yeah.
Oh wow, because I'm
I
from
wanted
LA.
to.
I went to high school in LA, and during my time being studying there in high school, um, I think 2 maybe 3 years in a row, we the air pollution got really bad because of the forest fires, and we literally um the high school that I went to was like miles and miles and miles away from the fires, but still the air was covered in ashes and all the cars were covered in ash, and that air pollution was really scary for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off of that. I live in Simi Valley, and we have like the worst wildfires every single year because we are like 10 miles away from LA. So we now have fire days at our schools, which was kind of crazy. We took off 2 weeks because the fires were so bad, like they were completely circling our high school that people had to evacuate. Like my best friends had to evacuate, and we also just have a long history of environmental injustice in our city, including like America's only unclean power spill in the country that's still not cleaned after like 64 years that I didn't learn about until high school when my AP teacher told me about like we literally have like nuclear power spill in our like groundwater. And then also we also have lead poisoning within our soil. And additionally, my family moved from Vietnam because their villages were affected by Agent Orange in the Vietnamese War. And also, their pollution is so bad that my grandma, she had like intense asthma when she lived in Vietnam, but when she came here, it was like it completely disappeared. So we have a lot of history with air pollution.
Yeah, so that was actually a perfect transition to my next question. So moving on to the next one, Emmett highlighted how while the impact of pollution varies among individuals, ultimately no one can actively avoid it due to its constant presence in the atmosphere. So, what are your reactions to this? And in considering this reality, what steps do you think individuals and communities can take to reduce the effects of pollution?
I think in the podcast, Emma talked about the EPA branch that looked at civil rights and environmental injustices with air pollution and water quality, etc. And when he said they investigated 0 cases so far, it just reaffirmed what I had, like the thoughts I had about the government already with environmental injustice, that they really just don't care. And from personal experience, like I've worked on like trying to fix that nuclear power spill in my city, and they're still arguing about who to clean it up because no one wants to pay for it. It all comes down to capitalism at the end of the day. So I think like we ourselves like can take part like trying to carpool and stuff and trying to drive less and et cetera, but it takes systemic restructuring to fix these issues, because as we can see, like these agencies aren't going to do anything. It's so hard to fix environmental redlining because it's already in place for generations, and these these intergenerational effects have passed down into like epigenetic mechanisms as well. So people's children are going to be born with these diseases that are caused by the environment. So yeah.
Yeah. I feel like Emmett also highlighted the fact that these companies know what they're doing. Like it's it's malicious. Like they know the power that they have and like the communities that they're affecting. And like Matthew said, like the government isn't doing anything about it. But I feel like in the face of such like systemic injustice, it's super easy to feel overwhelmed and like feel like you as an individual can't do anything. But I think it's important that we recognize that there are people doing things like are there are normal people doing things, and I think if we organize and show the government like we care about this issue and we're not going away until you do something about it, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I love how Emmett mentioned that we can participate in deciding where budgets go to. I After he mentioned that, I felt more empowered and not powerless in terms of like what is going on within policies.
Yeah, I think like with this topic, talking about like individual actions is kind of difficult because, as Matthew and June both said, like there's so many systemic problems that need to be fixed. But I do agree with like advocating for what's going on in your community. Emma also brought up like grassroots organizations and smaller organizations that are doing something, like as opposed to the EPA who's unable to do so. Supporting those organizations is really, really important. But yeah.
And then additionally, I wanted to go off grassroots organizations as well. Like just like I know like people have so much climate anxiety these days. Like Iram said, like it's just so paralyzing to hear everything. But I feel like grassroots organizations are so good. And also people underestimate the power of the youth vote, sorry. Especially during this voting year, especially since it is a voting year, but voting for local representatives that you want to see and that you trust, and also like putting people of color that are affected by these situations into positions of power so they can fix it is tremendous work. Like that is like what we can do as a collective, like because individually like it's so easy to believe like the climate propaganda that is being fed to us, like it's all our individual fault, but it's actually these companies' fault. So I feel like just mobilizing and collectivizing like into huge movements is the way to go. Yeah.
I'm gonna emphasize what Matthew said again for listeners, but like vote. If you have the right to vote, you can vote. Please vote. Like these are issues that are so important to our future, the future of like our like the next generation as well. So do your research, make sure you're voting for the people you know will support what you believe in.
I want
And
to
also,
Oh,
oh no, you
you
can go
go,
first, Iram.
Matthew.
No worries.
But I wanted to ask Jasmine, can we also give some information about what are the right ways of researching? What is trustable information?
For me, find that just looking directly at their political campaigns is very helpful. I because with our history of like fake news and very like directed news with our outlets, I think just kind of finding the root of that information yourself is just so important. Listen to their debates, be involved in that sense, like hear what they have to say, because sometimes the what they what other what outlets may say about a candidate may not really reflect what they want to do, what they want to try to do. Look at their history of what they've been doing in the country, because a lot of them are probably not coming from like zero political background. Like they have the experiences, they have like already like founded, like they have some foundation of political like influence in there. Look at what they've done in the past to see whether they can support what we want, the change we want to see in the future.
Oh, and additionally, to add to that, see who is funding these bills and policies, and also your representatives, because they will try to pass bills and policies, especially in California. They're really good at that in California, because when I voted in October, I had to see which funds were funding like these bills and policies specifically, because they try to word it like it's like scientifically now. They try to word it so regular voters don't understand how these bills and policies will affect the everyday person. But then once you look into it and you see which individuals are funding each policy, then you'll see like, oh, if this like policy is climate like friendly, why is Exxon or Mobil or like any big petroleum giant funding it, like putting millions of dollars to get it passed? Like just question why and where are these policies coming from? Yeah.
Yeah, you guys brought up great points about the significance of community level action, and I also thought it was pretty upsetting to hear about the unfortunate reality that organizations or agencies with the power to make more immediate change are not taking the initiatives to do so. So to segue into the environmental challenges faced by communities in the Imperial Valley and Salton Sea region, um, I was wondering what your guys' thoughts were on that when Emmett was discussing his research.
For me personally, I just think like no one gives a crap about the Salton Sea. Like no one talks about it, and it is so crazy to me because when I learned about Emmett's research and all that, um, these pollutants are so toxic, and they will be like spreading throughout San Diego County and Riverside County and et cetera, et cetera. Like it's like a huge crisis because the sea is drinking like exponentially, and this dust will carry so many toxins that we as individuals cannot control. Like it's out of our individual action to like not inhale it. So I think it's just so like disillusioning, really. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
I feel like it was very super scary. Firstly, I think it's important to realize that like even if you're not in the area, like all of this is interconnected. Like there is no such thing as like one isolated incident of like environmental damage. Like eventually it'll come back to affect you. So yeah, I think it's important to care about it even if you're not necessarily in that place. Yeah.
For me, this was like a completely new topic that he talked about because I'm not from the area. So, like, hearing about how close it is to us and like these effects and like how detrimental these effects are is just like was really shocking to me. And I know I need to do like further research on it to see where I can help. And yeah, June, you brought up a really good point of like what you think may not affect you will eventually come around and affect you. This is a large scale issue, right? Like we may not see the effects on us like today, but we don't know what the future holds like 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yeah, it's better to take action now than wait until it gets to a critical point.
I also liked how Emmett framed the Salton Sea as explained the roots of the Salton Sea and how it is still indigenous land, and indigenous people are being so affected by this because we have dumped like tons and tons and tons of toxins and pesticides onto their traditional land, and the government just still does not care about it. So it's just so disheartening. And all the local people that live there too, all the farmers, they rely on that land to do agriculture. So it's just needs to be prioritized immediately, and that's why it's important to vote. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm in like the same boat as Jasmine about like not being super familiar with it. Um, I found it like really insightful to learn about just because like the effects are not immediately affecting you. It's still there. It goes off of like what Emmett was saying about traffic being the largest or most dangerous form of air pollution. Even if you live in a less polluted area, it's still there and it's still going to affect you. So it's just important to be aware of these issues. And so, going off of like natural disasters that marginalized communities are vulnerable to, Emmett highlights prioritizing equal access to healthcare resources over thinking about like specific disaster solutions when it comes to um, helping these marginalized communities. So, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you think communities can be supported in the aftermath of natural disasters?
To speak on this issue, also referencing my SIN project from last quarter, we had climate migrants, so this fits perfectly. We talk about harm mitigation, because a lot of peace agencies, as Emmett talks, like the Peace Corps and stuff, or like charity organizations, come in only after when the damage is done, which is quite horrible because that doesn't give any autonomy to the people living there to like try to prevent these events. So I feel like government agencies and if these charity organizations need to give the infrastructure for these people to actually mitigate damage on an everyday basis before disaster happens, because once disaster happens, it is billions of dollars worth of fixing, and also people are going to be displaced already and become climate migrants, and that is irreversible at that point. So giving people the autonomy to have solutions in real time is the most important.
So Emmett mentioned like a bunch of different sources of exposure to contaminated water and their health effects. Um, which did you guys find most concerning?
I think the easy one to get concerned about is lead. I feel like we hear a lot about like exposure to lead. Uh, yeah. So I'm pretty worried about that. Uh, but honestly, like everything, like it's just terrifying. The notion that like something we consume, we have to consume every day is contaminated and like not safe. Like we can't trust it. Like I think that's like such a scary idea. Um, yeah.
Additionally, I was shocked about caffeine. Actually, caffeine pollution in water. That was like I was like, whoa! I didn't realize that, because I was like, wait, people actually consume caffeine on like crazy basis. So like, how would that affect our water systems and especially our marine wildlife? So, and it's just so concerning because I know these toxins lead to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, or additionally like ADHD. When I mentioned ADHD due to pollution, I was like, okay, this hits too close to home right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm concerned because um if like yeah, we hear water pollution, but we also hear water filters, but how well do the filters really work? Can we feel safe with the water filters? What is like what how can we, if our water is polluted, how can we recover from that? How can we make it pure again?
For me, what was really shocking to me was when Emmett was talking about like uranium and arsenic in like water supplies. And to me, like those are like big words of like dangerous, like not safe, right? And just considering that it might be something that we're ingesting or like near like just near us is just so shocking to me. And like, of like we definitely have heard about the lead in water because of the Flint water crisis, but I have never heard of like arsenic or uranium cases that have been brought forth. And then another point I want to bring up when we're talking about like water, access to water is like water bottle companies. These companies, essentially what they do is like they'll find a clean source, they'll package that water, and they'll sell it to the communities that don't have water, or don't have clean water access. And I think that's just, it shows how capitalistic everything is, and like how we profit off of like people's like issues, or like there's just so many better ways we can go about it if we use those resources to actually fix the water source in the communities, and or give them access to the clean water supplies. Like it's a whole different issues, but yeah.
Yeah, to go off of that, I just wanted to talk about when Emmett said there is no safe level of pollution. It's just crazy that these agencies are like, we don't even question like what is an acceptable level of pollution. There is no acceptable level of pollution, and we just like agree like, oh, there's like it's okay for this amount of arsenic or uranium or lead to be in our water, and we don't question it because it's just like something we can't control as consumers of water through like our city systems. And I think like I just it's just so concerning. Yeah. And especially after Flint. Oh my God, Flint is so bad. Jesus Christ. But there's probably so many more Flint, Michigans out there that we don't even realize because people just aren't caring, or they just aren't testing the water, or they just don't want to change out the pipes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just not being nationalized on a public level. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, speaking on the bottled water thing, I know a company that's like really guilty of this is Nestle. Like Nestle in particular, I've heard has like incredibly horrible practices with their water like acquisition and distribution. Also, they like whole different story, but they like produce like artificial baby formula and like packaged it and marketed it to mothers, and it actually had like no nutritional value or something, like minimal nutritional value, and they were marketing it as like a better alternative to breast milk, and it caused like a lot of issues in babies. So yeah, Nestle is one of those companies that like they profit off of people suffering. Like, yeah,
Yeah, I think what's important is kind of like being aware of where you shop, where you buy your goods, what companies you are supporting in the long run, whether it's for this issue, for any of the issues that are going on around the world. Um, and then one other thing that I did want to bring up is, which I forgot, so I will come back to later. Sorry.
oh, Matthew, you got it.
Oh, I was like, okay, so we can't have Nestle as our sponsor anymore for this podcast. We just literally just blacked them out. Okay, but anyways, I just wanted to talk about like it's just so hard as an individual to regulate all these systematic issues. Like we can't control where we get our water from. Like that's just so impossible. And even if we try to clean up our groundwater, that pollution has been there for decades now because people have refused to clean it up. So, and if we want to get clean water, we have to buy bottled water, and that goes into like whose resources are these and where is the water coming from, and is nature going to be even more profited off of in the future? And it's just so intersectional that it hurts my head to think about sometimes. But yeah, grassroots organizations is like the only solution I can think of for this situation. And public awareness is really good. People don't like change won't happen unless the public is on your side. So
Yeah, so adding on to the public awareness thing, like a lot of people don't believe like climate change is an issue, or this is an issue that is going to detrimentally affect every single one of us. And for that reason, like if you can support climate research, like if you have the money to do so, support research, support like efforts to that promote like spreading information to communities, to individuals, and like showing the truth of what's actually going on, because a large part of this is that we don't know what the effects are, and we won't know for a long term for some of these cases. For some of the stuff like uranium, arsenic, we may not know until like 20 years from now. Like our generation might have a lot of neurodegenerative like diseases that we just like will connect it back to what's going on today. but like the best thing you can do is like support research and like read research papers.
And it's also just so irritating, like reading some of these studies, like agencies will take these studies and be like, there's no long-term effects of these pollutants, but there are no long-term studies of these pollutants, so they just use that to justify polluting, which is so insane to me. Yeah.
One thing that I was surprised wasn't mentioned in the interview was microplastics. Um, I feel like that's like our generation's lead at this point. Like I think I read somewhere that there's like people can't do research on the effects of microplastics because there is no control group. Like all of our water sources are contaminated by microplastics. Um, and like it's difficult to tackle that issue because again, it's such a systemic thing. Like our culture and our society promotes the use of like single use plastics so much, and like the way that it's disposed of is not entirely within our control. Like even when we recycle things, there's no guarantee that it'll make it to a recycling center and be recycled. It's honestly very likely that when you recycle something, it's ending up in the ocean. Like like it is, it's not just a real possibility. It's like that is probably what is going to happen. Like not to say you shouldn't recycle, but like just to put into perspective the fact that like even the things that we do control aren't necessarily within our control in the grand scheme of things. Yeah.
And then additionally, I did want to shout out one of our other SIN groups that are working on a project right now. June went to a beach cleanup for one of them at Imperial Beach, and it is like very pertinent to San Diego and water pollution, especially because all the wastewater is dumped out of Imperial like Valley Beach, and that is actually causing a lot of bacteria and virus growth that is really detrimental to human health. And the government doesn't care about that, but they're making a magazine on it right now. So I just wanted to mention.
So those were all the questions I had for our discussion. So if you guys have any like closing remarks about the interview and what you learned or found insightful, um, this is yeah, just anything.
Um, Even though we talked about a lot of depressing shit today, I really wanted to just highlight climate optimism because people really get really like turmoiled about this. So especially me, because I am like the most neurotic person I know. But climate optimism, just don't blame yourself for everything. Blame the companies. That's the real issue. And also, just like if you do want to make change, there are so many wonderful local organizations out there in your community. Like just type in like beach cleanups, etc., like plastic pickups, river cleanups, etc., etc. You will find like a million of them in your area if you do want to feel like you want to make a physical change. But also, reading research papers about this, finding um, policy groups that are trying to pass more environmental policy into your county or etc. There's just a lot of ways, and we will highlight those in our Instagram if you want links for San Diego. Thank you.
Yeah. Matthew mentioned the other group doing the magazine earlier, that I went to the beach cleanup for. Absolutely fantastic. They did a great job. They killed it. They collaborated with Surfrider San Diego, and I think they hold beach cleanups regularly. So if you're in the San Diego area and you want to go to a beach cleanup, it's probably a good bet. Um, yeah.
Oh,
Yep, all
June.
those research. Oh,
Oh wait, sorry, Jasmine. No, okay. I just wanted to ask June, what did you see at Imperial Beach that day when you were cleaning up?
It was pretty. I think the thing about Imperial Beach cleanups is that it's not necessarily the amount of trash that's there. It's the sewage in the water and in the surrounding area. Um, so I think that group, the people in that group mentioned to me that there was like a river or like some body of water nearby the beach where the pollution was the worst that they had went to, and there was like trash everywhere. It was like foul smelling. It was the worst thing ever. But when I did go to the beach cleanup, I still did see a lot of trash on the ground. like especially small plastics. I think there was a lot of those, and um, also we found like three dead bird bodies. Like that was crazy, and like a large, like probably not human, but like vaguely human shaped like part of a arm. Um, it's probably like a seal or something, but like yeah, like it was not pretty. It was not a clean beach for sure.
Yeah, and that brings me like just one individual action you can take is clean up your litter. Like please, dear God, don't litter. And also if you see litter on the side of the street, you can pick it up so it won't go into the environment and degrade there. Yeah.
So yeah, all of the resources or like grassroots organizations that are in this area, as well as beach cleanups, we'll do our best to highlight them. And then my only point would be vote. This is a big election year. For the love of God, vote, please.
Okay, thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode. We thank Vicky for hosting, and then we also thank Emmett for being such a wonderful guest. Emmett, if you are listening, 10 out of 10, we love you. Like, oh my God. And then next week's episode, there is going to be no guest. I couldn't acquire a guest, but I will be my own guest. And next week, we will be talking about medical racism because that is what I'm graduating for next, like in the next 2 weeks. So hopefully y'all like it. And it's going to talk about a lot about the topics that we discussed in this episode for environmental racism. So yeah, tune in for next episode, and it might be our last episode, so please tune in. Thank you.